Hey everybody, today we are talking about monetary policy, another tool in the government's toolbox when it comes to stabilization policy. And more specifically, we'll talk about how the Federal Reserve uses monetary policy to impact aggregate demand and aggregate output, and how they use monetary policy as a way to stabilize the economy. And we'll discuss briefly a concept known as money neutrality, which points to one of the limitations of stabilization policy, both monetary policy and fiscal policy. So we talked about this in Unit 3, just a reminder that the Federal Reserve looks at the economy and determines what they think the appropriate interest rate should be for the level of growth that they want in the economy in order to maintain low inflation and high employment. And so they set a target for the federal funds rate. And that federal funds rate is the interest rate that banks charge each other for overnight loans to make sure that they meet the minimum required reserve. And the way that they achieve this federal funds rate that they want to achieve is through the Federal Open Market Committee. They're either going to buy or sell Treasury securities in order to get the money supply at a level that leads to the interest rate that they have set as the target. So the Federal Reserve looks at the market and they say, the current interest rate is not where we want it to be. We believe that the new federal funds rate should be lower than it is today. And so the way they're going to do that is by shifting the money supply curve to the right. They're going to increase the money supply. And the way they do that, as a reminder, is they either buy or sell Treasury securities. In this case, they're going to be buying Treasury securities. And the way to keep this straight in your head is to just put yourself in the role of the Federal Reserve and pretend you're rolling into a store that you buy stuff from on a normal basis. When you buy something from somebody, you typically hand them money and they hand you something back in return. That's how purchasing things works. And we're all familiar with that. So try not to put yourself into a lot of anxiety and stress. Just put yourself into a context that's familiar. So you go into the store, you buy something. You give them money, and they give you a thing. In this case, the Federal Reserve is going to give banks money, and they're going to give the banks are going to give the Federal Reserve back Treasury securities. And that's what's going to feed money into the banks, which then allows them to loan through the fractional reserve system. Now, why did they want to do this? Why did they want to increase the money supply in order to lower interest rates? Well, this gets at how monetary policy is used to stabilize the economy. If the economy is in a recessionary gap, like you see there in the bottom right, the output is less than potential output. It's less than full employment. And so we want to somehow get aggregate demand to increase or shift to the right. And so the Federal Reserve will increase money supply in order to lower that federal funds rate, which puts more money into the system. So there's more lending that's being done. Lending is less expensive in the loanable funds market as well. And that means that investment increases from businesses, and that increased business investment is increasing the demand over in the economy, the aggregate demand for goods and services. So it's going to cause AD to shift to the right. And if they've set the interest rate at the right level, it will shift aggregate demand until we get back to long-run equilibrium. We could do the same thing in reverse if there was a recessionary gap, in which case the Federal Reserve would say aggregate demand has gone beyond full employment. We need to start tamping it down, bringing aggregate demand back a little bit to the left, in which case the Federal Reserve could raise interest rates, in this case by selling Treasury securities, in order to take money out of the banking system and place it into the Fed, where, as we said before in Unit 3, money at the Fed is dead. Now, are there limitations of monetary policy? Yes. First off, if the economy is already in equilibrium, then there's no need to be messing around with monetary policy. You just sort of set the interest rate and let it go. Monetary policy, if done incorrectly, can end up destabilizing the economy. So the Federal Reserve has to be very careful here that they don't overstimulate or understimulate. If the Federal Reserve is too reckless, they can increase the money supply by a significant amount, and that's going to cause massive levels of inflation, as we're about to see. If they don't increase the money supply fast enough, you can actually end up choking off investment and causing a recession to occur. So one of the limitations on monetary policy is that if you give too much money into the system, it's going to create inflation. But the other limitation is that long run, the economy tends to adjust itself. So unless the Fed is constantly playing with the market and the interest rate, the economy is going to end up bringing itself back to long-run equilibrium. So we can sort of take a look at that process. If the Federal Reserve chose to pursue an expansionary monetary policy, they would be lowering the interest rate by buying Treasury securities, which would cause aggregate demand to shift to the right. So for a long-run equilibrium, suddenly we would find ourselves in an inflationary gap situation. If that were to happen, we'd have price levels going up, but also output. Now, left alone, the economy will readjust itself back to long run. At some point, wages will adjust because they are flexible in the long run. So wages will rise, causing short aggregate supply to shift back to the left. So despite the fact that the Federal Reserve has attempted to increase the economy through expansionary monetary policy, in the long run, the economy is going to adjust itself back to its long run state so that there's no increase in output, but there is an increase in price level. This concept is known as neutrality of money. Basically tells us that a change in the money supply has no effect in the long run on output. The only thing that a change in money supply will do is increase price levels by an equal amount. So if I increase money supply by 5%, then we should see an increase in the price level of 5%. So there is a limitation to what the Fed can do. It cannot create permanent economic growth. It can only create sort of a short-term effect, which is why it's not an engine of growth itself, but instead a tool to correct and stabilize the economy, to bring it back to long-run equilibrium. It is not a tool or a magic wand that can create economic growth in and of itself forever and ever and ever. Now, having said that, it's also important to recognize that that's also true with fiscal policy. Because the economy is constantly adjusting itself back to long run, federal stabilization policy is not something that can create long-term permanent growth. However, federal stabilization policy is a very effective tool in addressing both recessionary gaps and inflationary gaps. We'll talk more about these concepts in class, and I'll be happy to answer questions then. Until then, take care. See you then.